Wolf Warrior 2's music was composed by Joseph Trapanese. Phew, that was close. Hi, welcome to the Silver Spleen. My name is John Matrix, and this is my review of Wolf Warrior 2. Because it only just opened in Hong Kong, that's why. 2015's Wolf Warriors was a pleasant surprise. Wu Jing was funny, entertaining, and very watchable, playing Lung Feng, a PLA soldier who joins the elite Wolf Warriors and fights against evil foreign mercenaries led by Scott Adkins. Wolf Warriors wasn't great cinema, but it's at least as good as all the direct-to-video stuff that seems to be the larger part of Mr. Adkins' resume. And I'm not dumping on him or direct-to-video either. Direct-to-video movies know who their audience is, and those movies give the audience exactly what they want. How do you think Chuck Norris paid for his house? Produced, starring, and directed by Wu Jing, this sequel is an exponential improvement on the original in budget, scope, quality, and entertainment. By and large, Wolf Warrior 2 looks really nice. Asterisk, the digital effects are often kind of lacking, but good CG is really, really expensive. And considering the intended audience for this movie, I'd say the digital effects are good enough. Going back to what I'd said about Chuck Norris, it's important to remember that he was always more of a cult figure in American cinema. Yes, he made movies, and yes, people watched them, but he was never going to make Sylvester Stallone nervous. That was Bridget Nielsen's job, but I digress. The American 1980s action jingoism genre, like the Rambo series and Chuck Norris's Missing in Action series, and even Tom Cruise's Top Gun, made a lot of money, but they were never considered great cinema. They were designed to appeal to a very kind of working class audience that we might colloquially call Joe Sixpack. Those people didn't watch, for example, 1988's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. There's a good reason Zhang Yimou didn't direct Wolf Warrior 2. Because let's face it, Wolf Warrior 2 is really meant for someone we might euphemistically call Huang Mao Tai. Which is apropos considering that Mao Tai gets a pretty prominent product placement in Wolf Warrior 2. And I'm not mad. This movie knows who its audience is, and it gives it what it wants. And I think you kind of have to keep that in mind if you watch it. Now, anybody watching this review is not the intended audience for this movie. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth watching, because it definitely is. Due to events that we are shown early in the film, Lung Feng is given the big chicken dinner and ends up doing the duffel bag drag all the way to Africa. Not any specific country, just Africa. A good place where bad people do bad things to good people. And so a good person has to do bad things to bad people for a good reason. Which sounds funny until you realize that's basically the entire action genre in a nutshell. It's also the level of complexity that, 99% of action movie plots achieve. But so what? I never wanted to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger, wax philosophical. I just wanted to watch him kick out of people and say goofy shit. My name is John Kimball. No, it isn't. In Wolf Warrior 2, Lung Feng must rescue a Chinese doctor from the clutches of a band of evil mercenaries led by a Westerner named Big Daddy. No, really. His government can't help him, and no one else will either. He's in a race against time, and the odds are against him. Oh, and there's a girl, too. All this movie needed was for Survivor to write the title track. I think the easiest way to talk about Wolf Warrior 2 is to look at the way that it very faithfully mirrors a lot of the tropes of the action genre. It's big, loud, fast, and entertaining, with a straightforward story, a clearly defined hero, and a supporting cast that's very, very watchable. The star of the movie is buff, has an extremely photogenic smile, and handles his action scenes so easily it might make you mad. Then you remember he also directed the entire movie himself. Wu Jing has a lot to be proud of with Wolf Warrior 2. It recently became the highest grossing Chinese movie in history, and I'm happy for him. I was even, surprisingly, happy for myself when I watched it. Look, let's face it, there are some political things in this movie that a lot of people have talked about. It's not what I would call ideologically commendable, but neither are a lot of American action movies, or a lot of American movies. A few times I was actually kind of surprised by the things that were in the movie because I didn't expect them. In the opening scene of the film, a group of corrupt businessmen is demolishing a village in China. But even when the police show up, they're not necessarily on the victim's side. I was honestly surprised when I saw it, in a pleasant way. The same goes for the way that interracial relationships are portrayed in Wolf Warrior 2. Some of the Chinese workers have African wives, and I really enjoyed the way that it was portrayed. Because in real life, the people in those relationships don't always get a lot of social reinforcement, especially online. Now, yes, there are things in Wolf Warrior 2 that I don't necessarily like or agree with in political, historical, or ideological terms. But guess what? That's why I don't watch Hollywood superhero movies, or just a lot of American movies in general. Because I have the exact same problem with them. Whatever political or cultural missteps Wolf Warrior 2 makes, it's just walking on a very well-worn trail that Hollywood is largely responsible for creating and maintaining. Wolf Warrior 2 literally calls a place such and such Bay, Africa. And then somebody says that in looking for something they've asked half the chiefs in Africa. But, you know, it's a good thing that Hollywood treats Africans and Asians with so much more care and respect and decency. I hope I'm not going to have to point out that there's no simplified Chinese character for sarcasm. Fingers crossed. I can't even begin to imagine what the comment section of this review is going to look like, but I bet we'll see red. See what I did there? Besides, I learned things in Wolf Warrior 2. I never knew that a large African woman singing Amazing Grace in unaccented English was actually the Chinese Navy's equivalent of, like, the bat signal. But one thing I do know is that Wu Jing has watched Tears of the Sun. Wolf Warriors 2 is a lot of fun, and like I said, any ambivalence that I may have felt was leavened by knowing that I'm really just kind of watching a movie that takes the 1980s Hollywood action war framework and just flips it over onto a diametrically opposed political viewpoint. Let's face it, it's good for us. Look, we deserve whatever jingoism and xenophobia Wolf Warrior 2 indulges in, because we allowed Jean-Claude Van Damme to remake Bloodsport at least twice. We brought it on ourselves. And speaking of the 80s, I don't necessarily think that it was some kind of homage, but at one point in Wolf Warrior 2, somebody drops an atomic elbow. And if we're being honest, I have to say that Wolf Warrior 2 actually does a better job of either occasionally poking fun at itself or being remarkably fair and honest. In one scene, a phone call points out that the American embassy, unlike the Chinese embassy, is closed. But what immediately follows, thankfully, doesn't belabor the point. It reinforces it, but it does so implicitly in a way that's so entertaining that it could never, for example, be in a August 1st movie. Sometimes Wolf Warrior 2 unintentionally lightens the political mood. There's a shot of the Chinese Navy sailing bravely into a port that the American Navy is shown fleeing. But the next scene, which takes place in the port, features very obviously CG ships docked at a very obviously fake pier. But you know, look, anybody looking for subtlety or accuracy or realism in an action movie needs to have their head examined. I mean, look, I never knew that a 24-inch drone carried the same payload and weaponry as an A-10 Warthog, but I've seen it in more movies than just this one. And really, who cares? Just blow stuff up. Wolf Warrior 2 is just a lot of fun to watch, although, I imagine African people might have some deserved ambivalence. There's this one shot of Wu Jing acting, some might say, in the quintessentially American action hero manner. And what's interesting about it is that it references the first movie, it makes him look even more badass, and he's even doing it to an American. It's great! I couldn't not love it. In the final showdown, Wu Jing beats Frank Grillo so badly that he turns very visibly into his stunt double. But white people all look alike, so it. When that fight ends, and unless you're in a coma, you know who's gonna win, there's a very obvious political point being made through dialogue. But because of the way the dialogue is written, at least in the English subtitles, and because Frank Grillo isn't an action movie actor, he's an actual actor who actually acts, this political point isn't very obtrusive, it's undidactic, and within the generic boundaries, it's very entertaining and effective. August 1st Studios could learn an awful lot from Wolf Warrior 2, because while they share a very similar message, Wolf Warrior 2 is about 1,000 times more watchable than Founding of an Army. And I say that as somebody who represents the bad guys in Wolf Warrior 2. Now, it certainly helps that Wu Jing is a much better actor than, Chuck Norris, but so is my mother's begonia. That's not a euphemism. The only thing I really didn't like about Wolf Warrior 2 is when it jumped the tank. I'm not gonna spoil it, but I will just say that, for example, in real life, you can't drift a T-59. You just can't. And I saw a comment in another review that said, no, that's real. No, it's not. CG tanks, on the other hand, can do anything you can imagine. The much discussed passport shot at the end of the movie didn't really bother me. Like I've been saying, these kinds of movies are made for an audience that I'm really not a part of, and most likely neither are you. And I think it's very obvious that this film's audience welcomed it with open arms and wallets. There's an epilogue that I thought would be part of the teaser for part 3, and looking at the geography of it, I began to think that maybe the tagline was going to be, "The Dalai Lama finally gets what's coming to him." But I was wrong, because it turns out that the bad, white, redundant guys who pissed off our hero were actually working for someone else, and they're not Chinese. The end credits feature an NG reel that's a lot of fun, very informative, and really entertaining. It also proves beyond a doubt that Wu Jing and everybody else worked really, really hard on this movie, and you have to respect that. Now, I'm sure most of you were expecting that I was just gonna scream about this movie, and in theory I guess I could, but I have to say that I really don't want to. Yeah, there are things in it that I don't necessarily like or agree with, but going back to, I don't know, Ip Man, the difference with Wolf Warrior 2 is, you know what? Say things I don't agree with, but if you entertain me while you're doing it, I'm not gonna care. That really was always my issue. I don't object to nationalism, I object to nationalism that's poorly presented, which is why I don't watch Chuck Norris movies, and I only own the first and the last Rambo movies. But that's not my point. I suggest that you watch this movie, if only because I'm sure you'll have a reaction to it one way or another, and whatever your reaction is, I'm happy for you. If you get a chance, watch it in the cinema. It's a lot of fun, nice, big, and loud movie. It's an action movie. That's what they're supposed to be like. So go do that. Otherwise, wait till you can rent it or buy it. Yes, I know piracy is still an issue in China, but that doesn't make it okay for you to steal this movie. Besides, I don't think Wu Jing wants you to do that. But now that I've babbled enough, let's try to wrap this thing up, right? So you know how it's gonna go. When it gets released to home video, I'll update the description with a link. Speaking of money, please click on Patreon, because if nothing else, look what I've done. I've moved it over here. It used to be over here, now it's over here. There's things I filmed in this review that you're not gonna get to see unless you're one of my Patreon supporters. And believe me, it's not flattering stuff, so it's worth the money. If you enjoyed my review, please let me know. If you didn't, let me know. If you want to scream and yell about how I know nothing, well, go ahead, but I might point out the fact that you're very likely to miss a few things. And please, I do know that there's a simplified character for sarcasm, but there isn't one for gullible. If you enjoy this channel, please subscribe, because I'd like to have more subscribers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.